transmission of a nerve impulse. So let's see how a nerve impulse transfer. So a nerve impulse is transmitted from a one neuron to another. So there is one neuron. Neuron consists of the dendrites. It has a cell body. It has axon. It has axon terminal. So at the terminal there is called as something called as synapse. A nerve impulse is transmitted from one neuron to another through a junction which is known as synapse. So here it is a nerve terminal where there is a junction which is known as synapses. So the synapse is formed by a membrane of a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron. So there is something called as presynaptic neuron and postsynaptic neuron which may or may not be separated by a gap called as synaptic cleft. So there may be a gap. This gap is known as synaptic cleft, or there may not be a gap. So there are two types of these synapses which are present. One is called as electric synapses and second one is chemical synapses. Electric synapses is it is a faster than that of the chemical synapses. So let's see. So I draw a one neuron for you all, and this has now terminals like this. So this is our axon. So these are dendrites like this. So here similar, here there will be another one and this will continue. So the nerve impulse, it will travel from one neuron to the next neuron, and there is something called as synaptic cleft where, and this is called as synapses, which is present. So which will be present at the nerve axon terminals. So at the end of the nerve axon. Okay, so we'll see how. So this is a nerve axon terminal. So this is called as presynaptic membrane. So this is a presynaptic membrane and this is a postsynaptic membrane. So this is a postsynaptic membrane. Nerve terminals, it has a vesicles like this. So these vesicles contain a neurotransmitters which is present in it. This is called as a synaptic cleft. Okay, this is a synaptic cleft which is present in between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic membrane. So what happens when an action potential comes or a nerve impulse comes? So the calcium which is present, the calcium channels which are present, they will get open and the calcium will be released, and this calcium will cause the vesicles which are present to fuse at this presynaptic membrane. So ये जो है presynaptic membrane पर जो vesicles ऐसे fuse हो जाएंगे and it will release a neurotransmitter. Now this neurotransmitter is known as acetylcholine. So there are many such neurotransmitter present, but let's see this. So here a neurotransmitter called as acetylcholine which is present. So here there are receptors present at a postsynaptic membrane. Where receptors are present? Receptors are present at a postsynaptic membrane. So these receptors which helps in the binding of these neurotransmitters which is released in these synaptic cleft. So there are neurotransmitters which is released in the synaptic cleft. They will get bind to these receptors which are present at the postsynaptic membrane and helps in the transmissions of the impulse. So because of these receptors, the sodium channels will get open and there is that depolarization takes place. So the process begins with an action potential. So I've told you the process will begins as an action potential and electrical signal. So action potential and electrical signals is the same thing. So that will travel down to the motor neuron towards the neuromuscular junction. So this is known as neuromuscular junction. Okay. So the action potential will reach to the axon terminals. Here it will reach. See, once it is reached here, which is at a motor neuron, so the action potential reaches the axon terminals, which is the end of the motor neuron. So this is called as end of the motor neuron. Within the axon terminal, there are specialized membrane bound structure which is called as synaptic vesicles. So these are our vesicles which I have told you all. So the vesicles contain neurotransmitters. Okay, that is called as acetylcholine. So the arrival of the action potentials at a axon terminal, it will trigger the opening of the voltage gated calcium channel. So this voltage gated calcium channels, they will be triggered and in the terminal membrane, and the calcium will rush into the axon. So once this calcium will rush into the axons from the extracellular fluid, the increase in the calcium ions inside the axon terminals causes the synaptic vesicles to fuse. Like this, these synaptic vesicles which are present, they will fuse at the terminal membrane. As a result, acetylcholine is released into the synaptic cleft. See, like this neurotransmitters which is present, that is called as acetylcholine. It will be released into the gaps, which is the tiny gaps between the motor neurons and the muscle fibers. So this is a tiny gap. So acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and bind to the specific receptor. So these are specific receptors which is present at a postsynaptic membrane. So they will bind there. So acetylcholine diffuses across the synaptic cleft and bind to a specific receptors sites on the motor end plate of the muscle fibers. The motor end plate is a specialized region of the muscle fiber membrane. The binding of the acetylcholine to the receptor triggers an opening of an ligate-gated sodium channels to the motor end plate. So okay, and the sodium influx will take place. So sodium will rush inside into the muscle membrane, creating an electrical depolarization that is known as end plate potential, which we have already seen how depolarization takes place, how there is a changes in the polarity takes place, that we have already seen. The electrical synapses, the membrane at the pre and the postsynaptic neurons are in very close proximity. So they are very close. Electrical current can flow directly from one neuron into the other through the synapses. Because of these synapses, so it can directly flow from one neuron to the next neuron. So there are many neurons like this present and it can travel from one neuron to the next. So the transmission of the impulse across the electrical synapses is very similar to the impulse conduction along the single axon. Why? Because they are similar because they have similar of that of the electrical current which can flow, and it is because of the electrical synapses. So the impulse transmission across the electrical synapses is faster than that of the chemical synapses. So electrical synapses are rare in our system. So which we have is the chemical synapses and it's not a electrical synapses. Usually electric synapses is a faster one. Chemical synapse, the membrane of the pre and the postsynaptic neurons are separated by a fluid filled space which is called as synaptic cleft. So like this synaptic cleft is present which is a fluid filled space. The chemicals called neurotransmitters. Here we have seen neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Many such neurotransmitters are present. So which involves in the transmission of the impulse at these synapses. So what is required for the transmission? So for the transmission, we requires a neurotransmitters for the transmission of the impulse. So any impulse to travel, we require a neurotransmitter to pass from one end to the other end. Like we can think about a delivery boy who can transfer any whatever you order. For example, if you order some very tasty food, it should get transferred to your home. So who does that job? It is a delivery boy who does. Same thing here for the transmission of the impulse, the neurotransmitters are present. So the axon terminals contains a vesicles. We have seen it contains a vesicles like this which contains neurotransmitters. So when an impulse meaning the action potential, arrives at an axon terminal, it stimulates the movement of the synaptic vesicles towards the membrane. So what it will do, it will stimulate the movement of these towards the membrane where they fuse. So they will fuse like this at a synaptic membrane and with the plasma membrane and release a neurotransmitter, which we have already seen at a synaptic cleft. So release of the neurotransmitter bind to the specific receptors which are present at the postsynaptic membrane. So this is very important. So the binding opens the ion channels, allowing the entry of the ions. So the ion channels which is present, they will get open and there will be entry of the ions, which can generate a new potential in the postsynaptic neuron. The new potential develops maybe either excitatory or it inhibitory. So either it will facilitate a process or it will inhibit. So it can be excitatory or inhibitory.